So friends, in this part of the discussion, we take up other questions that are related to Robert Frost as a poet, and he was actually expressive of his emotion through words that would have a telling effect on the reader. And he is known for that kind of pithy statement, and he would evoke more than he would tell. So this kind of poetry is a different kind of poetry in the 20th century, when people are quarrelsome, people are irritated, people show their anger, and this person sits back, is relaxed, and he is taking cognizance of the no's and the don'ts and the do's of the world in which he lives. So I would request Professor Bajaj to now take it up further in the context of his poems in particular.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Prakash. I would like to now also put Robert Frost in in this kind of contemporary American context. He's the first poet to speak at the inauguration of a president for John F. Kennedy, and there is an anecdote around it that the glare of the sun was too sharp, and it prevented him from reading the poem that he wanted to read, which was a dedication meant for President Kennedy. And because he could not read it, he decided to recite the poem from memory, which is titled The Gift outright. And this poem in a way aligns, I felt, with a lot of what Whitman also, so he's taking forward this kind of Walt Whitman's tradition, and therefore he is also known as the poet of America, or the national poet of America in the 20th century. The job that Whitman did in his own time is carried forward in the works of Robert Frost, because as you very rightly said, that he is able to maintain his equanimity in a time which is ridden with these complexities and these uncertainties owing to the world wars, etc. And it is in this period that he is also able to write with balance and a sense of quietude. So I think that is also to be understood about Frost. The poem that I was referring to here is The Gift Outright. Now look at how he looks at the entire his vision of America and what America has become in the 20th century and how he views it. Now this poem is obviously in many ways seen as a dedication to America, but at the same time people have also seen a kind of an undercurrent of a kind of irony maybe, or a sense of a vision that is compromised. I mean, you're open to respond to it as you think it best, but let me read it out for you. It's called The Gift Outright, and 1961 is when it was recited. Now I quote, "The land was ours before we were the land's. She was our land more than 100 years before we were her people. She was ours in Massachusetts, in Virginia, but we were England's, still colonials, possessing what we still were unpossessed by. Possessed by what we now no more possessed. Something we were withholding made us weak, until we found out that it was ourselves. We were withholding from our land of living, and forthwith found salvation in surrender. Such as we were, we gave ourselves outright. The deed of gift was many deeds of war. To the land vaguely realizing westward, but still unstoried, artless, unenhanced, such as she was, such as she will become." So, unquote. What do you think of this poem?
Very well recited. Yes, this poem is very deep in the sense, that it talks about the relationship between the person and the land, and the person came later, and the land was his or her, and then he evolves a kind of perspective out of this interrelationship between land and the person,
the people.
individual.
So I thought that this was about America and the nation that America has become. And the idea taking back to the roots, he's taking us back to the roots from where we came. The land was ours before we were the lands. That we never developed a sort of oneness, or we never developed a sense of nationhood until we because we were always looking towards the West. If we recall that Whitman's problem with American literature was exactly that. In his own time, he said that we are constantly aping Europe and looking towards Europe's kind of admiration. Therefore, we are never close and one with the land that we are a part of. And this is the same idea that Frost, projects here, that the land was ours before we were the lands, that we never felt that the land was ours. And that we never gave it to it while it gave to us. It gave everything to us, but we never took it as our own, because the land, we were, before we were her people, so which means that we did not really feel a sense of nationalism, because we were always, we were England's. We had our affinity with England, and we were still colonials, and therefore we could never become the people. So I think it's a poem of being and becoming in many ways, that who we are, reminding us of the identity that is very distinctly American. And also the fact that he brings in the wars here. You said, what about his position on the wars? He says, we were withholding from our land of living, and forthwith found salvation in surrender. Right? So only when we joined with the land and we became aware that this is the place that we belong to, not England, not Europe, did we begin to see ourselves as a kind of a nation. And then it says, such as we were, we gave ourselves outright. The deed of gift was many deeds of war. Suggesting that, what we have given to this world, to the land vaguely realizing westward. So I think the idea that we are taking over the wars of the West, the wars of Europe over ourselves. Also suggesting that, what have we given to this land? The land gave us everything, and we were always looking towards Europe, and we have given the deed of gift was many deeds of war. So wars are not American in that sense. Wars, this is the gift that we have given to our land, which we should not have, perhaps.
I would like to give it a different twist, in the sense that human beings move around the world, and they go from one place to another, and they have different homes, one from the distant from the other, and at the same time the land remains the same. So the land is the uniting factor, and human beings are the dividing factor.
Right.
And this kind of a contradiction between the human being and land is before the human beings came, and it will remain perhaps after the human beings are gone, if at all. He is going into these questions, and he finally said that nation is land. Human beings, move away from it, but finally they come back to it. So that's the uniting factor. This is how your recitation, left its impact on me.
Yeah. Also the fact that, America cannot be, needs to develop its own identity as an American country, and he felt that the wars, taking over the wars, was not something that America perhaps should have done. So I think in many ways one can read it as an anti-war poem also.
It is an anti-war poem.
So
yes.
You can see that he's talking about realizing oneself, not based on England or the colonials or the past.
He's talking about colonialism.
Yes,
he's talking about departure from one's own culture.
Right. And he says, no, we have not developed a culture because we are always looking at another culture as our own, but that's not true, right? And he says that there are still unstoried things, that there are still we have still not developed in that sense a very uniquely American identity, and we seem to be attaching ourselves with Europe, England, in such affairs. So,
and he's using England as a very fine metaphor.
Yeah.
England still remains in America. Now they should say goodbye to England and start living there in America.
And reciting this in at a president's inaugural ceremony.
Yes.
So in that sense, reminding the people of America who they really are, and that they may not take proxy battles and wars, and may not become a part of wars that they are not supposed to, that they have no business to. In that sense. So I thought
and see the tragedy. He does it at in 1960 or 61, and within 2 years, the president himself is assassinated.
Yes, that's true. Right. So in a way, I think this I thought was could also be seen, because mostly you don't find Frost talking directly about wars or about the political situation. He eschews this kind of metaphors also, but there is a kind of an irony, and there is a kind of a deep-seated irony that emerges in this poem as in others. So but mostly he's seen, he spent his childhood in farms in Vermont, in New Hampshire, and wrote about the simple pleasures of life that he found there, and this is what he found most appealing, and that's why he became more known and famous in the small towns of America, where language used was colloquial and all of that. So I think references to country life abound in his poetry, and nature of course has special places in poems, such as the poem that is often always quoted, which is Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, which was written in 1922, where he says, and I quote, "The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep." So again, the idea that the idea that one would be a part of this of nature, of woods that are lovely, dark and deep, and yet that is a sacred aspect of it, and yet there is a work ethic that he is also the value of labor, I think, is very pronounced in Frost. He values labor, and he values this kind of a work that he's supposed to do, even when he's tempted to probably go around in the woods, and he says, but I have promises to keep. So I think there is a sense of commitment when you say I have promises to keep. These are commitments of life to live life not anarchically, but even the idea of discipline again comes in. Remember, we were talking about how new and old are negotiated in his poetry, or tradition gets negotiated with the modern. I think here you can see how desires and temptations are also find moderation in promises, which are more like a pattern, a discipline that you put on yourself. So I think he's a poet who's constantly also guided by his commitment to his work, commitment to life itself. And you see that kind of poetry in his works. There is also the philosophical strain in him. For instance, there's this poem like Nothing Gold Can Stay, and it's again his kind of rumination on life and death. He says that nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold, her early leaves a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sang to grief, so dawn goes down to day, nothing gold can stay. There is a sense that there is a kind of a cycle, there is an acceptance of not just dawn, but acceptance of the closing of the day or the dark. There is an acceptance of grief. There is, so Eden sang to grief immediately takes you to Milton, for instance, So, and Milton's, basic idea at the center of Paradise Lost, I thought, was not to show the fall of Adam and Eve, but to also foreground their ability to labor and to find value in working for themselves. So I think again, Eden sang to grief also refers to a sense that there is an acceptance that this is the course of life, how nature is, and how leaf subsides to leaf. So nothing gold can stay. Again, you could call it a philosophical take on fleeting things, that nothing remains the same, or on time and on
it's
mortality.
A new point you are making regarding the closeness of Milton with Robert Frost, but I think there is a sense in that human beings can live with simplicity and with commitment, even without all the trappings of culture.
Yeah, both using blank verse also.
Yes, that's true. And in Paradise Lost is the milestone there of that kind.
Trying to use blank verse, and also again going closer to the actual lived experiences of common people. So the acceptance, what I don't know to what extent we can, I'd say that Milton was still in many ways trying to tell us about, inform us about God's ways to man, in that sense about Christianity also. But I think Frost has resolved that conflict. He doesn't go into Christianity to find any resolution, because resolution is found in I think he's a happy mix of Milton and Wordsworth.
True.
You know,
Please elaborate this point. I think it's a good point you are making.
Because he's able to see going into nature and processes of nature as in its self-fulfillment. And again, Stoicism, the Stoic idea is based on virtue in itself as complete and enough for living. And anything frivolous or all the extravagances of life, one could turn indifferent to all of them. So that kind of Stoicism which you see in Milton, but tempered with a romantic strain that you see in Wordsworth. So there is a romantic in him, but also a classical sort of framework. I'm not too sure if that makes sense.
How do you call it romantic? I'd like to know that.
Because he's constantly, so there is a kind of joy, for instance, when he's talking about all his nature poetry, the woods are lovely, dark and deep, or when he's referring to, other poems which are Dust of Snow, for instance, where he's, or apple picking. These are all very everyday things of that occur in nature, the cycle of nature, the beauty in the very processes of nature is what he picks up for projection. Like nature's first green is gold, So I think he's able to see the beauty of nature, whether he's also, and he's able to see, you could call it the blizzard of the storm fear as a kind of a sublime, if you like. But Dust of Snow is so sensitive. I'll just quote it from there. It says, "The way a crow shook down on me the dust of snow from a hemlock tree has given my heart a change of mood and saved some part of a day I had rued."
This is just like Wordsworth.
Yes,
you're right.
You're right. So this is what I mean. This is the romantic in him, that he was sad and he rued this day, and just then a crow came over him and showered on him the dust of snow. And he says, this crow retrieved for me, gave me a change of mood and saved some part of my day that I had rued. So there is celebration of life, there is assertion of life, and in fact a rejection of modern is despair.
Very true.
So there is no, even when there is trauma, as I quoted in the poem Out Out, you find that there is not despair in his poetry.
And very rarely, but in this poem that you quote, there are so many references to me, I, which Frost would not generally do. Wordsworth does it all the time, and Frost also does it here.
Yes, he does it. Actually, his poems are also very dramatic. If we have some time, I could refer to one of those dramatic poems. There is a lot of dialogue. Even Out Out also has dialogue between this boy and talking to his sister. "Please tell the doctor not to cut my hand," he says, and then the doctor says that, "Well, we have to." So there is drama there. So these are very dramatic poems. One of important poems, actually also very dramatic, is Home Burial. And Home Burial is again heart-wrenching in many ways, because you find that it's about a conversation between a husband and wife who have lost their child. And he develops it on a scene that she came down, she was coming down the stairs and she looked out of the window and stayed there. And the husband is urging her, also asking her to come out of this grief, and the woman Amy is not able to come out of that grief. And the whole poem is a conversation that goes on around this. So these dialogue dramatic poems, particularly the one I'm referring to, Home Burial, is based on this idea of loss, this idea of mourning, even when there is quiet calm. It is steeped in tragedy, because it captures this kind of a conversation between husband and wife who have lost their son. And and she can see from the window the little graveyard where all their dead people are buried, and she has grudges against this man who she says that, "How could you dig your own child's grave. And the man says, can't a man speak of his own child he's lost? And she says, no, you can't, because you don't know how to speak of it. So she's able to see the child's mound there, so it's a very dramatic poem, but it shows the strain in their relationship that is visible till the end, and they are unable to communicate with one another. And I'll quote one of those. He says, my words are nearly always an offense. This is the man speaking to the wife. I don't know how to speak of anything so as to please you. The man urges the wife, let me into your grief, while the woman thinks, he's sneering at her. And, it builds this kind of complex relationship and a complete breakdown of communication. So this is a poem where I thought that I could see a modernish sense, how this is a sort of a modernist poem, because it's talking about vacuity of life, which is talking about breakdown of communication channels. One doesn't understand the other, but this is based on loss and grief, which is very intense and personal, and the man is determined till the end, I will draw you out of it. So therefore I don't see that kind of despair that you see elsewhere in other modernist works. This is what I meant when I said this Home Burial is one of those poems which are dramatic, which is intense, and which speaks of grief, loss, breakdown of communication, but then retrieves itself in the will of the man to find a way out of the situation. Again, the will to find the self-determination also ties up with the word endurance that I first used for Frost.
And in the last poem that you quoted, referred to, also has a tale to tell. It's a kind of a story, and through
yes,
that
it's a story.
through dialogue, so it's dramatic.
Yes.
And through this drama, and it stands out as a poem in Frost's general
yes,
poetic
true.
oeuvre.
It's not that kind of lyrical poetry,
Yes.
even though it has meter, so it just goes on and on. You can feel this kind of rhythm there, but it's not a pure lyrical. It's not a monologue in many ways. There is a dialogue, there is tension, there is clash, because the woman is blaming the husband, and she says, let me quote one more. She says, you could sit there with the stains on your shoes of the fresh earth from your own baby's grave and talk about everyday concerns.
This is horrifying.
Yes. And the man saying, but what am I supposed to do? So there is each trying to cope with that loss in very different ways, but the woman finds him very insensitive, that how could you sit with stains on your shoes of that fresh earth that took your child in the grave. So in a way it's shocking, it is trauma, it is very you get goosebumps when you read this poem, but the tone becomes very soon generic and universal. It is not just a personal grief, loss, etc. Soon he turns the emotion into something more a broader thing, which you could call universal, on life and death, which is one of his preoccupations. And towards the end you have the projection where the wife says, friends make pretense of following to the grave, but before one is in it, their minds are turned and making the best of their way back to life.
So, in the entire discussion, there is a kind of a running thread. So, would you like to sum it up in a particular way?
I think some of the characteristics of Frost poetry, I think they would be one, that there is a lot of emotional authenticity. He's, in his poems, you can see that the emotion is felt. What the poem that we just discussed, Home Burial, could be seen just as his personal way of reconciling with his child's death. And the strains that come along with how to manage grief. So I thought that he's a poet who's intense, and his voice is very authentic when he projects these emotions. He's also a poet who is able to introduce both in his poems joys and terrors of rural landscape, of the world of nature, of rural New England, and the other side of England, New England, that is the other side of America that we don't know yet of. We always speak of the industrialized world or the elitist world of universities, but there is, Yale and Harvard, but there is the other side, which is the rural landscape that he builds his poems on. And therefore during his own lifetime, in his early phase, he was often seen as a kind of a regional poet, because he brought alive the region, the place itself, the farmlands where people lived in Vermont and others. But his poetry also carries very strong tragic strains of grief and loss, of brutality of nature, sudden accidents that happen all the time leading to deaths. So the unpredictability of things, and there is a kind of uncertainty attached to life itself, and the role that the human subject then is to play vis-a-vis this kind of situation, which is endurance, again the word that I use. He's also a poet who builds on some complex relationships, as in Home Burial, takes up philosophical questions of life and death, of living and what it entails and how to live. But he's also somebody who protests rigid mindsets and is skeptical, open-ended till the end.
One line about this person is as a national poet of America.
As a national poet of America, because I thought, like Whitman, he can build, you can see the country through his eyes. You can see the rural life of the country through his poems. What are their daily activities, what they do, the saw, what kind of saw they use, what kind of farms are they living on, what are they enduring during peak winters when blizzards are there. So I think there is the poem, his poetry is able to paint the huge landscape that America is, and bring in emotion through people's dialects. Very importantly, he is able to use the very Yankee dialect also often in his poetry. So I guess that's what makes him a national poet. But as a poet, he said this, and I'd like to end my discussion on this. He said in an essay, Robert Frost, he says that how is poetry to be written and what is a poem? And he said, I quote, "No tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. No surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader." Unquote.
Well, these are the apt lines from Robert Frost that end the discussion, and I'm sure, friends, that all of you have enjoyed the talk about Robert Frost as a poet of many ways, of many directions, many predilections, and finally he comes out as a poet of wisdom and a poet of pithy statements. So all these things are there converged on him, and I'm sure that this will give you a lot of thought to consider and to take up things in your own way, interpreting him as a poet. Thank you.